Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Delores Greyeyes. Dr. Greyeyes is currently the director for the Navajo Division of Public Safety, the Department of Corrections, and planning for youth justice centers across the entire Navajo Nation. Prior to taking on this role, she was a quality assurance specialist under the Division of Social Services. As in this role as specialist, she developed their case management continuum and reviews of the cases directly impacting children in and out of home placements and pending termination of parental rights and adoption cases. She did this training to help improve services for Navajo children and families. Prior to this time, she has more than 15 years of experience doing case and social work and supervision within social services. She holds a BA and a master's degree in social work from Arizona State, and she earned her Ph.D. from Arizona State in 2018. And her research comes from her everyday work, her important work that she does for all of us. And she writes in her bio, there is no reason on the topic of why some of our people end up in the state and federal prisons and what paths lead them here and lead them there. So I want to thank you for that, Dr. Greyeyes. And more importantly, she is the mother, Shema, of Wendy Greyeyes, Dr. Wendy Greyeyes, who we have from Native American Studies, and we're so proud to have them both here. So Dr. Greyeyes, I will now turn this over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. Good morning and welcome, everyone. I am happy to be presenting to this Indigenous Education Research Conference this morning. I did my research over a period of several months in 2017 to fulfill part of the PhD requirements at Arizona State University. My background includes, of course, I got to introduce myself. I'm a member of the Bitterwater clan, born to the To'ahane clan, which is near water. My paternal grandfather is of the Hanawahni clan, he who walks around you, and my paternal grandfather is of the Ashihi, the Salt clan. Again, my background includes a BA and a master's in social work and more than 40 years in child and family services, mental health, and public safety. I currently am serving my 9th year as the Board of Regents at Navajo Technical University, and I also served on the Navajo Board of Education between 2015 and 2019, and currently the Director of Corrections with Division of Public Safety for Navajo Nation. My research focuses on school to prison experiences of adult Navajo prisoners aged 24 to 35. It's a reflection and stories by 6 young Navajo men and their educational experiences. It captures their education and disciplinary experiences at school and at home. It also speaks to what their experiences were as they interface with the criminal justice system. And based on their experiences, what are their recommendations for educational policy changes insofar as discipline and treatment strategies? My research really is divided into 3 sections. The first is intended to be published as an article. Here I did a literature review of school to prison, historical research that was done on school to prison, the different methodologies used, data collected, analysis and recommendations. And in my article, I speak to recommendations as a researcher, and I'll cover a little bit of that later on. And then the second section covers children facing personal trauma from parents and schooling because of the abuses they encountered in the educational system. It focuses on traditional methods of disciplines, intervention, and Navajo students in the school setting. It discusses also jailing as unknown to Indigenous people, the Native people as well as Native people across our country had different ways of disciplining their children. And then the last piece is a policy piece. It highlights the high incarceration rates on the Navajo Nation and recommendations to eliminate incarceration through use of more of the alternative methods of intervention prior to incarceration. It also addresses policy changes and red tape for families and their children and accessing services. My research topic really adds to research on Native and Indigenous peoples on their educational experience as it relates to school discipline, incarceration, and intervention strategies. It explores the experiences of young Navajo men through their stories and perspectives as they interface with the education and the justice systems. It explores the debate around the theory of school to prison pipeline. Is it true? It also documents the stories through the lens of the Navajo men who I worked with over the summer in 2017 on school to prison. It provides an opportunity for the Navajo participants to offer their insights and recommendations to improve the school system. The type of research and outcome. This was a qualitative case study exploring the experiences of incarcerated Navajo men ages 24 to 35 in the Winslow State Prison. Evidence from this study suggests that schooling plays a pivotal role influencing a Navajo man's life choices of incarceration and imprisonment. I looked at some data as well during that period of time, and what I found was astonishing that American Indian or Alaskan Native men make up 1.4% in national prisons, 1.3% in state prisons. And in Arizona alone, at the time, 25,000 Natives were serving time in state prison. And Navajo Nation at the time had 35,000 individuals. And this is an average that of incarceration on Navajo, although there are some duplication. However, the number of bookings are pretty high. Some of the informing theories that I used to do the study includes the tribal critical race theory. The key informing theory used was the tribal critical race theory. It looks at the historical practices of colonization, which continues to impact tribal communities through systems of power like schools and prison. The institutional goal is to separate and destroy Native ways of knowledge, their epistemology and ways of being, their ontologies. Excuse me, but I did have Bell's palsy to some extent. I have problems with my enunciation, so was replaced with the Western value system, which has been foreign to Native people. The colonial education system is dangerous and does not work for schooling and educational achievements for American Indian. It provides a context for understanding the history of schooling for Native children. It shows how the colonial education system is dangerous and does not work for schooling and educational achievement. The framework is best suited to understand how and in what ways educational discipline are in conflict with the needs, desires, experiences, individual worldviews of people. In terms of education, these tenets demonstrate the separation and destruction of Native epistemologies and ontologies. The traditional education, which is done through stories, will replace with Western ideals and individuality, a particular type of achievement and success. In tribal communities, Western education is linked with the importance of American thought of capitalism, and republicanism. The three research questions that I asked in my research was the first, how and in what ways do male Navajo prisoners make sense of the connections between their home and schooling experiences and their engagement by prisons? What are the most important factors that led to the school to prison pipeline for the Navajo men? What approaches and interventions can be identified to reconsider discipline policies for the Navajo male? The method used in doing this study included the NIB protocol for seeking knowledge. It was a qualitative, narrative, semi-formal interview using individual and group discussions. I observed the participants' expressions, behaviors, and tone to understand their experiences, their perspective in the process, develop a partnership with the participants. I did member checks using the transcriptions, the coding, and themes to come to findings. One of the things I did working with these individuals was that I had them review their individual interviews, the transcriptions. And it really sort of, I think there was a period of several weeks in between from the interview, then the transcriptions, and that opportunity for them to read their what they were saying, and they were surprised. Some of the open-ended questions were used to allow the participants to express themselves and tell their stories in their own words. Follow-up questions were used in the individual interviews to understand statements that were unclear and to use the peel back approach of the layers of issues that the participants had. Opportunity was provided to allow the participants to talk about how and what led to their incarcerations in their own words. And these happen in the individual interviews, and each individual interviews was anywhere from 2 to 2.5 hours during the periods that I spent with these individuals. I also did focus groups as a way to create a sense of community among the men, to show that there were others participating in the discussions. I think, you know, the interaction was just amazing for them to share. And they were saying things like, wow, you went through that too. I thought I was the only one going through, and I was ashamed. You know, those are kind of things that they talked about in these group discussions. And I think it brought them closer as well. Then I asked broad questions about the inmates' experience in terms of discipline at home, in school, and to understand their relationship with family and communities. And a lot of their experiences were very similar at home, because they all live on the Navajo Nation. Just the lack of resources, the distance that they had to travel to school, and their isolation mostly from the community, other than just a lot of the direct contact with family. Peer reviews were done to allow participants to review and discuss the common themes from my analysis. Opportunity to add, delete or make changes in the transcriptions were offered. So and during one of my work group session, they all got a copy of their individual interviews. They had a chance to read the transcriptions, and here and there I could hear, you know, kind of giggles. They were laughing at themselves and what they had said several weeks prior. They had an opportunity to delete things if they didn't want me to use it as part of my write-up. But very little change was made to the transcriptions, which I was really impressed. Some of the examples of the open-ended questions that I use include: when did they first interface with the criminal justice system? What experiences and memories they have of their school? What experiences they recall when they entered their first disciplinary action from school administrators? What experiences and memories they had of their families? How they interpreted the school to prison pipeline? Most of them didn't know anything about it. So I did talk a little bit about, the theory, how this name came to be. And most of them were saying, yeah, that really does fit, what I went through. That's interesting. So those were their comments. What recommendations would they have to prevent other schools from encountering situations that they did? In my findings, the schools had the most powerful impact in contrast to family, community, and other institutions. Simply put, school discipline is a factor that leads a person into the prison system. School experiences were mostly negative over positive experiences. The negative experiences include harsh physical punishment, verbal assaults, and abuse by teachers, school administrators, and etc. Some of them were told, you're no good, you'll end up in jail or dead. Some of them shared how they were told, we know your family. You don't come from a good family. You're just going to end up like your father, a drunk. Those are kinds of things that were very negative and traumatizing for these students at the time. There were some positive points, however, that were shared with me. And these positives were, some of them felt successful in helping them in certain areas, particularly, let's say, math was a discussion quite often. If the teacher spent some time helping them work through a word problem, they felt good about it. And so they felt real positive in that. And then they compared this to a teacher that came into the prison system. And most of them had gotten their GEDs while they were in prison. And one of the participants was saying, my teacher here spends time with me. They help me through working out problems, putting a sentence structure together. That makes me feel good. And that helps me to learn. I wish that would have been done when I was in school. Those were just some of the comments that they talked about as they participated in the discussions. The men explained that they played sports because it was physical and violent. This is where their anger were expressed, playing football, running track, basketball, where they could just put every energy behind what they were doing to succeed and be successful in the sports that they participated. And they saw their coaches as significant role models in their lives. And so they spent the majority of time at school. Even after the sports activity was over, they would remain around the school and go home late. And a common response to why they went to school was because everyone else was doing it. And we just had to, was the other response. School seemed to be the dominant feature in their everyday life. Another finding was that teachers and principals were identified as powerful focuses contributing to negative school experiences, negative forces. These men struggled with their classes, and sometimes teachers were not supportive, accusing them of disruptive behaviors. Conflict between the students and teachers were due to absenteeism, unattentiveness, napping, being argumentative with teachers and peers, and back talking to teachers. And this is where many of them explained that, I often went to school very tired because of some of the things that were happening at home. My parents were drinking. I was punished. I had to sleep outside because of all the noise and other things that were going on. I didn't eat, I didn't have any food. Those are some things that they shared as reasons that, they couldn't focus in school, and they just want to be left alone while they were at school. The principal was the authority figure to dispense punishment to the students. Participants explained that the principals rarely asked for their opinion and offered alternatives to counseling or mediation. Instead, detention or out-of-school suspension, expulsion, or arrests, particularly in cases when schools had resource officers, they were immediately turned over to the officers and then taken away to detention. And the majority of the reasons for disciplinary action was because of their fighting. And some of the negative family impacts that triggered dependency of the students in school for support was, in the lives of these men, their system of support begins with family, but when this primary system fell apart, the school became more critical for them. So when things were happening at home, they spent all their time at school. And sometimes they didn't go home for several days at a time because of binge drinking, fighting, and other things that were going on at home. School provided for these men the necessary relationships to make friends, to be among teachers. There were certain teachers that they liked, kind of hung around them, and then coaches seemed to be some of the more positive role models for them. And these, the participants didn't really get all in the community or with other institutions as they were in school. It seemed to be school and home, school and home. When the family broke down and became a place of discomfort, they again depended on the school system, which increased the key in shaping as Navajo men. The breakdown at home resulted because parents were attentive, they worked, they came from single parent homes, absent fathers, and they were verbally and emotionally abused. There were no reinforcement or support for any homework that they had to do. The recommendations was to use the sweat lodge ceremonies for relearning the foundation of culture, learning to pray in the Navajo traditional way, and to learn who they were. And some of the things that the participants talked about, not being able to pray until they got into the prison system, where they had additional counselors that came to the facility and what lodge with them, and that's who they learned to pray from. They learned their clan system from these individuals and other traditional teachings, and they felt really good about it. And again, the recommendation was that be made a part of the foundation learning as early as possible for young students going to school. They talked about not being able to talk about their problems at home. And some of them expressed that, I wish my teacher would have asked me what was going on with me at home. I wish the principal would have asked me. I would have told them. If I'd gotten help, I would have gone to get help, but I didn't know where to go or how to go about it. And those were some discussion. And then in the book chapter, using again the net peacemaking process to address issues from the onset. And this is where we talked about the Navajo peacemaking program that could come into the school system when students were having problems with schoolwork, being tired, and just not behaving. You know, the idea was to see and get intervention started as early as possible. And continuously, the theme throughout my discussion and their recommendation was that culture as a foundation was very important. And in fact, they talked about if that was given to them prior to going into the education system. One of them talked extensively about it, and he spoke to the fact that if I know who I was, if I had a foundation, that would have given me strength to be able to overcome a lot of the social issues, just the issues that were happening around him at school, at home, and everywhere else. And he spoke to clan, being able to find family, to say, okay, you are the same clan as I am. So, being able to make that connection and go there for help. The other piece on the policy paper, as I indicated, there was a high incarceration rate on the nation. And some of the things that came out of that was that, again, the sweat lodge ceremony seemed to become very important to these men, and counseling and use of the traditional medicine men services. And oftentimes in the, when people are incarcerated, particularly on Navajo, one of the things that we found is that 97% of them, their behavior, their criminal activity was tied to some type of substance. So the recommendation there was to get services to these individuals prior to incarceration. Some of the issues and challenges include that the study was very small compared to the thousands of Native people who are in prison. And it was also limited to a certain age group as well. So I really narrowed my focus to the young folks that were in prison. And I did that because I felt that they probably were the last group to have been at the residential boarding schools, had some input or some influence from the policies of the federal boarding schools. The Navajo men make up a large portion of American Indians in the United States incarcerated in tribal jails, in state and federal prisons. The focus group and interviews were done within the prison. I felt that maybe the prison space was constraining, that might have limited their input to the study. We saw prison guards walking by often, not inside the classroom we used. From the onset, they had assigned a prison guard to sit with us as I did the group sessions, but that really impacted, and the participants asked that they not be there. So we requested to have the guard outside. So that really kind of settled them a bit more and being able to talk about their experiences. The other challenge was that because they were in their early 20s to 30s, there were some level of, I felt, maybe memory of their educational experiences, and maybe sometimes they couldn't recall the details of specific disciplinary incidences, but I think they did their best. In concluding thoughts, there is a need for more research focusing totally on Native people in the area of school to prison. Change is obviously necessary in how Native children are dealt with in school as far as discipline, intervention strategies. And then, as we know, there's still a lot of the historical trauma of Native people resulting from federal boarding schools and other policies. Recommendations to include cultural intervention and services rehabilitations across the journal article, book chapter, and the policy pieces. And then this is the model that I use pretty much as far as the 4 directions. And we use this often to learn about ourselves, the 4 clans, the 4 sacred mountains, just addressing issues through this model. Thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Greyeyes. That's incredible work that you did. And we have a lot of questions and comments in the chat. So I'm going to call on you if you wrote a question, and you can either read it directly from the chat. But your work, Dr. Greyeyes, is important to me because I'm not going to speak to my own work, but I worked with and will be continuing to work with Native youth who are incarcerated at YDDC and Camino Nuevo. So a lot of the things that you were talking about, I didn't do interviews, but I taught there. So I agree with you. There's a lot of issues that need to be addressed. So I'm going to start off at the top here. Dr. Holmes says he agreed with what you were talking about earlier, and he said it's unprofessional behavior by teachers and administrators. It's not right. We have to create a different choice and alternative. And Wendy, Senior, you want to ask the question that you have in the chat?
Sure. So this one came through text. So the question was, how can our tribal colleges like NTU and the Net College support the rehabilitation of our incarcerated relatives?
I thought extensively about that. In fact, just going back to the participants, one of them, when I asked, what would you do? Or no, he asked me, what can I do to help my community children to not get into the same problems and issues that I have? And one of the recommendations he made was, I told him that because he was in state prison, we couldn't get him into the school system per se, personally making a visit there. But the idea shared was to do a video of the young men speaking to the issues and taking that into the classroom and using it as an educational tool. And so to answer the individuals at NTU or the Net College, that could be a project, is go into the prison system and get these participants to talk about their experiences as a prevention model to our young, the and other Native children that are growing up.
Thank you. Next question came from Gloria Hale. Gloria, do you want to ask the question directly, or you?
Thank you, Glenabot. Good morning.
Good morning.
Dr. Greyeyes, very well presented. Thank you so much so far. Okay, here's my question. Of the incarcerated men in your research, what is the data on those that came from some form of juvenile detention center or a jail system? Is my first question. And I ask that because I was a student hearing officer when I was with Window Rock School District as the assistant superintendent. And I had many young of our Navajo men that were enrolled that didn't complete their school year, but we designed something that we would help them boot them over into getting their GED. But I found out that 9 out of 10 ended up in some juvenile system or other, and there are serious other issues that came up. But that was my question.
That's an excellent question, because in the discussion, all of them had some contact with being held in the juvenile detention center, whether it be temporary while their parents came, notified and came to pick them up, or they spent time there in the juvenile detention center. So about 95%, I'd say, of the ones interviewed spent time in the juvenile detention center.
Were there any women or young girls?
I didn't include them in my research. I would have loved to, but it would have been, more time would have been needed to separate the two groups and be able to do some search and see if there are differences.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Atu, you, David, do you want to ask your question or your comment?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Greyeyes, for your presentation. I guess I start with my public defender experience as a trial lawyer for the public defender department, and making a real conscious decision to get Native clients assigned to me, because I think it does make a huge difference. A Native defendant sees a Native attorney representing them. I think there's a sense of reassurance and calm that happens, that they have at least a sense that somebody understands where they're coming from. One of the basic questions I used to ask all my clients was, what year did you graduate from high school? And I always asked it in the positive manner, which is, when did you graduate? And not surprisingly, a huge majority, 80%, did not graduate from high school, but I would get into discussions about where they grew up and things like that, just to know more about the client I was dealing with. I see a disproportionate amount of unfortunately, disproportionate amount of our Native people ending up in state jails, particularly at the juvenile level. I think that's where it really begins. You start to indoctrinate young people that in the juvenile justice system, by detaining them. They start to learn that this is they learn how to be, so I think that the more that we can provide alternatives to juvenile detention, the greater impact that we will have in lessening the adult Native male jail and the female jail population. That's where it begins, in my mind. As a tribal court judge, I was listening. I was really, my sister Glenna told me about invited me. I was very interested in your presentation, in that I wanted to see, based on your research, what parallels I could see in terms of the tribal members that I see in tribal court every day. And the parallels are there in terms of the educational deficiencies, the kind of the lack of sustaining support that they was lacking from the education at the very basic educational levels, from grade school, mid school through high school, and they just feel like they just kind of just felt left out and not supported. And so it's not surprising when you have that kind of I guess, I mean, just kind of, if at the education level, at the school level, of individuals are shown or see that it doesn't, they don't matter. They don't want to, the time has not been taken to help them understand and learn. They're going to go on and continue to believe that they don't matter. They continue their negative behavior because who cares, basically. So to I think, as I stated in my comments, being from Taos, I try to employ as many traditional methods of alternative counseling. One of the things that we talk about at Taos is and literally is an asking for forgiveness. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the methods that I employ. Is I bring in the family, and I have the individual, whether it's a man or a woman, to ask for forgiveness from their family members and the community members that they may have harmed with their acts. And through this act of asking for forgiveness, I believe that there's a greater understanding from that individual. Look, my acts did have an impact. Okay. Thank you. That's my perspectives, and I'm going to leave now. Okay, I could go on. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I just violated this, telling my older brother to stop. But we only have like 3 minutes left. So, do you want to say anything,
Yes, I want to just, I think the comment that was just made is by David was interesting because as I worked as a social worker for many years, and I was asked to speak at a symposium for our Navajo Bar Association in Albuquerque one year, and on the issue of foster care. And one of the things that I saw was that the children who we pick up, place in foster care, we don't really address the needs of the entire family. We punish the child by taking them out of the home. And then 6 months later, a year later, we return them into the same environment. And it's these same kids that are ending up in juvenile group homes, graduating on to juvenile detention, adult detention within the tribal setting, and then eventually state prison, county, and so forth. And the other thing that's really important too, that the year that I was doing my research, at the time, Russell Begay was the president of the Navajo Nation, and he met with the judges of New Mexico, and we found out 40% of juveniles serving time in detention were Navajo. 40%, just in the state of New Mexico. And that's really alarming. And yes, once we tell them you're not important, then if it's not corrected, either through counseling, a ceremony, of some type, they carry this. This is trauma. This is exactly what we talk about when we talk about intergenerational trauma. Sometimes as parents, we do this. And as teachers, professionals, so we need to change the way that we address our children as they go through, as they grow. So thank you.